Macroeconomics often is a discipline that talks about policies that the government can use to try and deal with a recession. Now, one of the concepts that we talk about is so-called fiscal policies. I want to make sure that you understand the distinction that is sometimes made between different types of fiscal policies, and also in another lecture to draw a distinction between these types of tax and spending policies and monetary policy, which is a quite distinct animal that we'll talk about later. So two general types of fiscal policies that you will deal with in your courses here. So one of them is changes in government spending on goods and services that can affect the demand, the aggregate demand in the economy. So another thing is to change the tax burden, and we'll talk about various types of ways in which taxes can be changed. One basic assumption that we're going to be making in most instances is that the government spending or the tax policies are going to be debt financed. What I mean by that is if there's an increase in government spending or there's a decrease in taxes, that any shortfall in government revenue, because you're either spending more taxes or you're spending more, there's more government spending or there's a decrease in taxes, is that you're financing that by borrowing the money. And it turns out that makes a big difference in the practical implications of this, but we're going to assume that if we talk about an increase in government spending, there's not an offsetting increase in taxes, or if we decrease taxes, we're not reducing government spending in other places to make up for it. So you're borrowing. There's a deficit, a government deficit associated with this. Okay, so let's talk about government spending. Now, there are a broad set of policies that we might call discretionary spending. This is spending that can change depending on what decisions that in the United States the Congress and the President might make. So, for example, infrastructure. The building of new highways, bridges, rail systems, new schools, physical infrastructures, long-lasting investments in, if you will, the capital stock. So that's one type of infrastructure. So spending. So you might increase the taxes there, or spending there. You might increase social spending on healthcare, on education, on the safety net, various other social targets that you might want to pursue. You might have defense spending, new military spending, and in the macroeconomic section of this course, when we're modeling this, we're actually not, for most of this, we're not going to make a distinction between the overall economic effect of these three different types of spending. Now, it's clear that especially the long-term impact of building a new highway system is different than building an aircraft carrier, is different than spending new money for healthcare. I mean, those have different long-term consequences. We're not going to deal with that distinction for much of this. Now, when we talk about the long run effects of macroeconomic policies, we will. But for now, we're going to set that aside. These are all potential areas where the government can increase spending. Now, I think it's also important to talk about this at the federal versus local or state level. So, for example, a state doesn't have military spending. The federal government does. States may have they may spend money to build a new highway system. They may spend money on education. So there's a distinction between those two that is clear. It's different decision making. It has different overall economic effects. Again, we're going to kind of set those differences aside. I mention this in part because the borrowing, the debt finance at the federal level, would be done by the issuance of treasuries, treasury bills or bonds. At least in the United States, that's what they're called. And so that's a kind of, it's government debt. Okay, so that's an issuance of federal government obligations to pay interest rates. At the local and state level, you might have, at the local level, a municipal bond. Okay, both of those are distinct types of debt used to finance different types of spending. Again, we're not going to make that distinction in much of this. Okay, so this is, here's things that we can do to increase the discretionary spending. So if you increase discretionary spending, you're going to increase the aggregate demand, the total economy-wide demand for goods and services, because you've got new spending. Okay, an increase in G when we talked about this before. In fact, if we think about aggregate demand as having these components, the consumption, investment, government spending, if the government spends money on new infrastructure, that directly affects G. Now, another type of fiscal policy is changing the tax burden. And there are really two that I'd like to focus on here. One is income tax rates. Okay, this is the percentage that is taken out of your income and directed to either the federal or even state level income taxes. We have what are called payroll taxes. That is, for example, payments for Social Security. For Medicare. For unemployment insurance. Okay, so these have very distinct uses, but they are part of the tax system and part of the things that a government can change. So we have these different types of taxes that can be changed. If you decrease the income tax rates or you decrease the payroll tax rates, that also can lead to changes in aggregate demand. Because you put more income in the pockets of citizens by lowering the taxes, they can then consume more. If it's changing the taxes on how investment is treated, you might in fact affect investment, but let's set that aside. Okay. Now, in real life, there is a big distinction between temporary versus permanent changes in fiscal policy. So, for example, let's say that the government announces, okay, next week you're going to you don't have to pay as much for Social Security taxes. After a week, we're going to raise it back up. That's sort of an extreme example. That particular version wouldn't occur. But if you had a very, very short-lived tax cut, people probably aren't going to change their long-term behavior. Maybe they'll just pocket the increase and go on about their business. Maybe they'll go out for a dinner, but it probably makes sense not to change your long-term behavior because of a 1-week tax cut. What if it's only a year? Same kind of thing. People say, well, I'm not really sure whether to change my behavior, if it's kind of just this 1-year thing. What if it's 10 years? Well, then it starts to maybe change your behavior a little bit more. If it's a permanent tax cut, then you really could change your long-term strategies because you think, okay, I'm going to get more money, more income, I can change my spending habits. The same way, if we had a bump up in social spending that was only 6 months, you probably don't have as long-lasting a result. So this idea about the temporary versus permanent fiscal policy is indeed very important. We are going to talk, when we talk about the short-run impact of these policies, we're not going to make that distinction. Okay, when we're talking about the short-run fiscal or tax of government spending or tax policies, we're going to really focus on just the short-term impact to deal with a recession. But it's important to make that distinction clear because the overall impact can be quite different. So we talk about this discretionary spending. I also want to note a general kind of spending which, as is often the case, is kind of obscure by the name automatic stabilizer. Okay, that sounds like something you'd have in the front end of your car when you run over a pothole. When we talk about automatic stabilizers in a macroeconomic context, what that means is that you're going to have an increase in government spending that happens really without any action by the government. So for example, when people become unemployed in the United States, they can receive unemployment payments as part of an unemployment insurance program. Now, one of the nice things about this is that it allows for an increase in spending when there's a recession. There's no action needed for the Congress and the President to take in order to increase the spending, increase aggregate demand in the case of the recession. It also has the social benefits of helping people out when they're in difficult times, but it doesn't. The important point here is that it doesn't require an action by Congress. Things start to get tough, the unemployment payments go up at the same time. Now, in contrast, and there are other examples of these automatic stabilizers that sort of naturally kick in. With discretionary policy, there's a problem with timing. Let's say you enter into a recession, the government decides to have a fiscal stimulus, increase in government spending. and it goes to Congress. It's negotiated in the House, then negotiated in the Senate. They don't like it. They go back. They take a look at that, and they authorize a level of spending. It gets sent to the president. The president vetoes it. It goes back, and it goes back and forth. It can sometimes take a long time to get that process going. It might even happen quickly. In the 2009 Great Recession, there was a stimulus package passed by the Democratically controlled Congress, signed by President Obama. And it still took a while to implement the increase in spending. So, for example, if you increase infrastructure spending, well, it does, it's not like you can build a new highway tomorrow. It takes time. So the discretionary spending on the fiscal side has the disadvantage that it can take some time to actually see the increase in aggregate demand. And the problem, especially if it's a short-term drop, a little blip in the economy, it's not something fundamentally wrong with the economy. By the time you get the funds in circulating and the spending increased, the need for it may be gone, which is another reason why the automatic stabilizers are a nice approach. That happens regardless of any action taken by the elected officials. So this is a general idea about fiscal policy and the details of different types, and at least some intuition about the potential different effects of different types of fiscal policies that might be used to change aggregate